Not exactly sure what to put in the description box when uploading your latest podcast episodes? It might seem like a minor detail, but it matters more than you might think. Getting your description right will significantly boost the chances of new listeners pressing play on one of your episodes. My name is James, and in today's video, we're going to outline how you can craft compelling descriptions that signal your show is worth listening to. With recording, editing, and distribution to take care of, podcast descriptions can often get pushed down the list of priorities. They can become an afterthought, cobbled together at the last minute in a rush to get your new episode live. But descriptions can be the difference between gaining a new loyal listener and having someone scroll right past your show in their podcast feed. An ideal description is clear and concise, but it's also enticing and injected with a bit of personality to hook people in. In contrast, a poorly written description signals you've not put much thought or attention into your show, and people will naturally be less inclined to take a chance on it. The podcast industry is so competitive these days that the little things like this really do matter. So today, we'll cover some of the best practices and tips you can follow to help get your podcast descriptions right. So let's dive in. When it comes to podcast description length, less is usually more. Due to the influence of social media, people generally have shorter attention spans than they did in the past, and if they're faced with long blocks of text, they'll be immediately turned off. So being concise is key.
Whoa! I'm not reading that crap. Summarize it in one word.
Apple Podcasts gives you 4,000 characters to work with, but you shouldn't need that much space. You want to give enough details to entice listeners in, but you don't need to spell out every little detail. We'd recommend sticking to a limit of around 1,500 characters, and if you can get your description in fewer characters, that's great. It's important to put the most crucial details at the start of your podcast description. Usually, this will include things like a brief guest bio and a quick summary of the central themes in the interview. Basically, you don't want to leave key details till the end of your description. So what do you need to try and fit in within that 1,500 character limit? Every show is different, but here are the top 5 things usually worth including for most podcasts. First, a concise summary of the episode. Dedicate a sentence or two to quickly and clearly describing what the episode is all about and the kinds of topics you're going to cover in the content. This will help people find out straight away whether your episode is what they're looking for, and if potential listeners don't know what to expect from the first few lines of your description, they're less likely to press play. The second thing to include is a guest bio and any relevant links associated with your guest. If you have guests on your podcast, including their names, background, and credentials is a must. This should give people an idea of why your guest is perfectly placed to speak on the topics that you cover in the episode. Include any relevant links too. If your guest has a website, social media profiles, or even their own podcast, it's good practice to list them at the bottom of your podcast description. Remember, your guest has given up their time to speak with you, and you should do what you can to reciprocate the favor by pointing people in their direction via your podcast description. The third thing to include is a list of questions that you answer in the episode. This is where you can show your audience exactly what they'll gain from listening. You might want to list some of the questions you answer in the show, and these should be aimed at your specific target audience. For example, if you host a fitness podcast, your questions might look something like this. Including timestamps beside the questions you answer in the episode can allow listeners to skip to that part that matters most to them. Remember, not everyone has time for full episodes.
Ain't nobody got time for that.
But partial listens still count. It does require a bit of effort to put in the timestamps, but in our experience, it's more than worth the investment. The next thing worth including is a list of relevant or helpful links. Your podcast description is the perfect place to link to your website or social media accounts for your podcast. This will make it easy as possible for new listeners to connect with you after listening to your episode. You can also link out to extra resources too. Anything you mention in the podcast, from articles to online courses, drop the links in the description and let listeners know where to find them in your episode intro. As you're editing your episode, it's a good idea to make note of any resources, tools, or websites you might want to link to in your description. The fifth and final thing to include are calls to action. You can put a call to action within the actual episode intros and outros too, but these might be easy to forget, especially if people are listening to your episodes while multitasking and can't follow through straight away. Putting the call to action in your podcast description along with a relevant link makes it much easier for listeners to navigate to the right place after listening to your content. Try not to bombard your audience with too many different instructions and calls to action. but asking them for one or two things to help you meet your goals can never hurt. Whether you're trying to grow your email list, build your Patreon subscribers, or signpost listeners to your sponsors, your calls to action in your podcast description can help you achieve just that. So when you combine all those 5 elements, what should the final product look like? Here's an example plug-and-go template you can use for inspiration. Simply swap out the relevant information and links for each episode and you're good to go. We will say every show is different though, so feel free to tweak this example to fit your own needs and personality, but this should be a good starting point for most podcasts. It may take a long time for you to craft these descriptions initially for your first couple of episodes, but you will get the hang of it. Like everything, it comes with practice, and by the time you're on to your 10th description, you'll be shipping them out in no time. That's it for this episode. Thanks for watching. If you find this helpful, please consider hitting that like button. And if you've got any questions about podcast descriptions, please drop them down below. Lastly, we are releasing new episodes of the Podcast Lab. They'll be coming out shortly, so you can subscribe to catch our latest tips and guides. See you next time.
Want to skip the learning curve and launch a top-tier podcast right off the bat? Then let the professionals handle it for you. At Podcast.co, we offer an all-in-one production service for brands, artists and thought leaders, and we take care of every single step, from branding and editing to marketing and distribution, and the results speak for themselves. Send an email to David at Podcast.co today to learn about how we can work together.